Picture this. You're a Japanese soldier, wounded and captured on a Pacific island, waiting for the inevitable torture and execution that your military code says is coming. You've been taught that surrender means dishonor worse than death, and that Americans are savage demons who show no mercy. But instead of a bayonet to your chest, you're given a blood transfusion, a life-saving surgery, hot food, and then something that makes you question everything you've ever believed. The American soldier who captured you bows respectfully and calls you honorable warrior. Today, we're uncovering one of World War II's most shocking transformations. The day Japanese prisoners of war realized that everything they'd been told about American brutality was a lie so massive it would change how they saw their entire world forever. The year is 1943. And something unprecedented is happening across American POW camps in the Pacific. Japanese soldiers, raised on the warrior code of Bushido and indoctrinated to believe that Americans are subhuman monsters, are experiencing something that their military leaders said was impossible: mercy from their enemies. For decades, the Japanese military had taught its soldiers that capture was the ultimate shame, that Americans would torture prisoners for sport, and that death was preferable to the dishonor of surrender. As a result, Japanese soldiers fought to the death, committed suicide rather than surrender, and when they were captured, usually while wounded and unconscious, they expected the worst possible treatment. What they found instead was so shocking, so completely opposite to everything they had been taught, that it created one of the most remarkable psychological transformations in military history. By the end of this video, you'll understand why thousands of Japanese POWs chose to cooperate with American intelligence, why many converted to Christianity in captivity, and how the American treatment of Japanese prisoners became a secret weapon that helped end the Pacific War faster than anyone imagined. But the story begins with a single moment of realization that changed everything. Let me tell you about Sergeant Hiroshi Takahashi. Captured unconscious during the Battle of Guadalcanal in August 1943. When he regained consciousness in an American field hospital, his first thought was simple: why am I still alive? According to everything he'd been taught, he should have been killed immediately. Japanese military indoctrination was clear. Americans were barbaric devils who tortured prisoners for entertainment before executing them in the most brutal ways possible. But instead of torture, Takahashi found himself receiving medical care from American doctors who were working frantically to save his life. When he tried to refuse treatment, expecting this to be some elaborate form of psychological torture, the American medic, through a Japanese-American translator, said something that stopped him cold. "We're not here to hurt you. We're here to heal you. That's what civilized people do." Takahashi later wrote in his diary, "That word, civilized, hit me like a physical blow. We had been told we were the civilized ones, that Americans were savages. But here they were, saving the life of their enemy while calling themselves civilized." Nothing made sense anymore, but this was just the beginning of his shock. The first Japanese POWs, captured early in the war, were so few that they became almost laboratory subjects for American intelligence officers trying to understand Japanese psychology. What these officers discovered was that Japanese soldiers had been so thoroughly indoctrinated with propaganda about American brutality that they were literally paralyzed by fear when captured. Captain Kazuo Yamamoto, captured at Bougainville, described his first day in American custody. "I spent the entire first day waiting to be tortured. When evening came and nothing had happened except regular meals and medical checks, I became convinced this was psychological warfare, that they were making me comfortable." Before the real horror began, the real horror never came. Here's where this story gets really fascinating, and where we see how deeply Japanese military indoctrination had affected these soldiers. Bushido, the way of the warrior, taught that death was preferable to capture, that surrender brought dishonor not just to the soldier, but to his entire family. Japanese soldiers were told that if they were captured, their names would be struck from family records, their families would be shamed, and they would be considered dead to their country. But American treatment created an impossible psychological situation for Japanese POWs. Lieutenant Saburo Ienaga, captured on Iwo Jima, explained the crisis. Bushido taught us that we should die rather than be captured. But what do you do when your captors treat you better than your own officers ever did? What do you do when the dishonorable choice of living leads to treatment more honorable than anything you experienced in the Imperial Army? American intelligence quickly realized they were dealing with soldiers who had been psychologically programmed for death, not capture. The solution was something revolutionary. They decided to treat Japanese prisoners not as dishonored failures, but as warriors worthy of respect. This approach was radical even by American standards. Many American soldiers, having seen Japanese atrocities and suicidal tactics, wanted revenge. But military intelligence convinced commanders that respectful treatment could yield incredible intelligence dividends. The results were immediate and shocking. When Japanese prisoners were addressed as honorable soldiers instead of cowards or traitors, when they were allowed to maintain their dignity and even some military protocols, something unprecedented happened. They began to open up. Corporal Masao Watanabe described the moment he realized American intentions. The American interrogator stood when I entered the room. He bowed slightly, not mockingly but respectfully. He said, "I honor your service to your country, even though we are enemies. Now, perhaps we can speak as soldiers." No Japanese officer had ever shown me such respect. But what really shattered Japanese preconceptions wasn't just respectful treatment. It was the medical care that challenged everything they believed about American priorities and values. Japanese military doctrine taught soldiers that their lives were worthless compared to the emperor's glory. Wounded soldiers were often left to die, and medical resources were reserved for officers. Japanese soldiers expected Americans to treat them the same way, or worse. Instead, they found themselves receiving medical care that was often better than what Japanese soldiers got in their own military. Dr. James Mitchell, who treated Japanese POWs at a base hospital in Australia, recorded his observations. These men were stunned, not by cruelty but by kindness. Many had infected wounds that had gone untreated for weeks. When we operated to save their limbs or their lives, they couldn't understand why we would waste resources on enemy prisoners. The story of Sergeant First Class Toshiro Nakamura illustrates this perfectly. Captured with severe burns covering 60% of his body, Nakamura was dying. In the Japanese military system, he would have been given a grenade to end his suffering honorably. Instead, American doctors performed multiple skin graft surgeries over several months, using precious medical supplies and countless hours of specialist time to save his life. When Nakamura finally recovered enough to speak, his first question to the translator was, "Why didn't you let me die with honor?" The American doctor's response, translated carefully, was, "Because in our system, keeping you alive is the honorable thing to do." This created what military psychologists called cognitive dissonance syndrome. Japanese prisoners whose entire worldview was being shattered by evidence that contradicted their most fundamental beliefs. But here's the most incredible part. American medical staff began noticing that Japanese patients were recovering faster and more completely than expected. When they investigated, they discovered that the psychological healing from unexpected kindness was accelerating physical recovery. Now here's where this story takes a turn that would change military intelligence forever. Traditional interrogation methods, threats, intimidation, psychological pressure, were completely ineffective on Japanese prisoners. These men had been conditioned to expect torture and death. They could withstand physical pain because they believed it confirmed their expectations about American brutality. But American intelligence officers discovered something revolutionary. Kindness was more effective than cruelty, respect more powerful than intimidation. Captain William Sebald, a Japanese-speaking intelligence officer, developed what became known as the Sebald method. Instead of threatening Japanese prisoners, he treated them as fellow professionals discussing military matters. His first success was with Major Hiroshi Onoda, a Japanese intelligence officer captured in the Philippines. Traditional interrogation had yielded nothing for weeks. Zabold tried a different approach. He entered the interrogation room, bowed respectfully, and said in Japanese, "Major Onoda, I am Captain Siebold. I understand you are an intelligence officer. As am I. Perhaps we can discuss our profession." For the first time since capture, Onoda looked up. Siebold continued, "I know you cannot betray your country's secrets, and I respect that. But surely we can discuss the general principles of intelligence work, one professional to another." What happened next shocked everyone. Onoda began talking, not about specific military secrets, but about Japanese military psychology, training methods, and organizational structure. Information that proved invaluable for American psychological warfare efforts. But here's the remarkable part. Onoda later said he talked not because he was breaking his oath to Japan, but because he was finally being treated with the respect due to a professional soldier. The intelligence gathered using respectful treatment methods proved far more valuable than anything extracted through traditional interrogation. American forces gained detailed insights into Japanese military thinking, logistics, and plans that helped shorten the Pacific War by months. What happened next was something nobody, American or Japanese, saw coming. Many Japanese prisoners of war began converting to Christianity. This wasn't the result of missionary pressure or forced conversion. In fact, American military regulations strictly prohibited religious coercion of prisoners. Instead, it happened because Japanese prisoners, experiencing unexpected mercy and kindness from their captors, began questioning the spiritual foundations of their own beliefs. Sergeant Yoshio Tamura described his conversion. "In Japan, we were taught that Americans had no honor, no spiritual depth. But when I saw American soldiers praying for wounded Japanese prisoners, praying for their enemies, I realized there was something in their religion that we had been told was weakness but was actually strength." The story of Father Joseph O'Malley, Catholic chaplain at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, illustrates this perfectly. Initially assigned to minister to American guards, O'Malley began noticing Japanese prisoners watching Christian services through the fence. When he asked through a translator if any prisoners wanted to attend services, he expected maybe one or two might be curious. Instead, over 40 Japanese prisoners requested permission to attend. O'Malley later wrote, "These men weren't looking for easy conversion or special treatment. They were searching for understanding of a spiritual system that could produce such unexpected mercy in wartime." But here's what's most incredible. Many of these conversions were genuine and lasting. After the war, several former Japanese POWs became Christian ministers, using their experiences of American kindness as examples of Christian love in action. The psychological impact on other prisoners was profound. If Christianity could transform enemies into merciful captors, what did that say about the spiritual superiority they had been taught to believe in? In early 1944, something happened that would change the entire dynamic of Japanese surrender and capture, but it almost never became public. Private First Class Kenji Matsuda, captured on Saipan, was allowed to write a letter home. This was standard procedure under the Geneva Convention. But what Matsuda wrote created a crisis in Japanese military censorship. His letter, addressed to his father, read in part, "Honorable Father, I live with shame but also with confusion. The Americans who captured me treat me with respect I never received from Japanese officers. They have healed my wounds, fed me well, and allowed me to maintain my dignity. I do not understand how our enemies can be more honorable than our own leaders." Japanese military censors faced an impossible dilemma. They couldn't allow such letters through. They contradicted everything the Japanese people were being told about American treatment of prisoners. But stopping all POW mail would raise questions about what was happening to captured soldiers. The solution was to heavily censor letters to meaningless phrases like "I am alive" and "I think of home." But families began reading between the lines. If their sons were merely alive after months or years in American captivity, it suggested they weren't being tortured or executed as propaganda claimed. But some letters got through uncensored, and their impact was electric. Matsuda's letter was secretly copied and distributed through his home village. Within weeks, similar stories were spreading throughout Japan. Whispered accounts of Japanese prisoners receiving medical care, education, and respectful treatment from Americans. This created what intelligence historians now call the credibility gap, a growing disconnect between official propaganda about American brutality and the reality reported by prisoners' families. By 1944, something unprecedented was happening in American POW camps. Japanese prisoners were volunteering to help with the war effort, not as traitors or collaborators, but as men who had come to understand that American victory might actually be better for Japan than continued Japanese military rule. The story of the Nisei interpreters illustrates this perfectly. Japanese American soldiers, many of whose families were in American internment camps, were working with Japanese POWs to gather intelligence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Japanese Americans who were considered security risks by their own government were proving more loyal than anyone imagined. Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Yamada, the highest-ranking Japanese officer captured during the war, made a decision that shocked both sides. After months of respectful treatment, he offered to help American psychological warfare efforts by writing leaflets encouraging Japanese surrender. His reasoning, as recorded in military intelligence files: "I have seen how Americans treat their enemies. If they can show such honor to prisoners of war, perhaps they can show mercy to Japan itself. Continued resistance will only bring more death to my countrymen." The leaflets written by former Japanese prisoners proved incredibly effective. When Japanese soldiers found surrender leaflets written by their own officers, describing respectful treatment and proper care, surrender rates increased dramatically. But here's the most shocking statistic. By late 1944, some Japanese prisoners were requesting permission to serve alongside American forces as interpreters and guides, helping to save American lives while encouraging Japanese surrender. This level of cooperation was unheard of in the Pacific War, where Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to fight to the death rather than surrender. What American military leaders began to realize was that respectful treatment of Japanese prisoners had created an unexpected strategic advantage. Psychological warfare more effective than any propaganda campaign. General Douglas MacArthur, initially skeptical of lenient treatment for Japanese prisoners, became one of its strongest advocates after seeing the intelligence dividends. He reportedly said, "A single well-treated Japanese prisoner provides more valuable intelligence than 100 dead Japanese soldiers." But the real breakthrough came when American forces began using former Japanese prisoners in psychological operations. The Voice of Truth radio broadcasts, featuring former Japanese POWs describing their treatment, reached Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. Unlike American propaganda, which could be dismissed as lies, these broadcasts featured voices speaking perfect Japanese, using military terminology and cultural references that proved their authenticity. Sergeant Ichiro Suzuki, broadcasting from an American radio station, told Japanese forces, "I am Sergeant Suzuki of the 32nd Infantry Regiment. I was captured on Guadalcanal expecting death and dishonor. Instead, I found Americans. What happened to Japanese POWs in American custody created ripple effects that extended far beyond the war itself. When Japanese forces began surrendering in larger numbers during 1945, it wasn't just because of military defeat. It was because word had spread through Japanese ranks that American captivity meant respectful treatment rather than torture and death. The Battle of Okinawa, which could have been even more devastating than it was, saw unprecedented numbers of Japanese soldiers surrendering rather than fighting to the death. American psychological warfare officers credited the respectful treatment of earlier prisoners as a major factor in this change. But the most remarkable impact came after Japan's surrender. Instead of the bitter, decades-long resistance that many predicted, Japan transitioned relatively peacefully to democratic government. Former Japanese POWs played a significant role in this transition. Takeshi Yamada, the colonel who had written surrender leaflets, became a member of Japan's post-war parliament, advocating for democratic reforms and peaceful relations with America. In his first speech to the Diet, he said, "I learned about democracy not from books, but from experiencing how Americans treat their enemies. A nation that shows such honor to prisoners of war deserves our respect, not our hatred." The contrast with other theaters of war was stark. German POWs in Soviet custody experienced brutality and often returned home as broken men with deep hatred for their captors. Japanese POWs in American custody returned home as advocates for peace and cooperation. This difference helped shape the entire post-war order in the Pacific, creating the foundation for the U.S.-Japan alliance that continues today. Here's what makes this story